Okay, of course we know from last chapter the two parts of the central nervous system are the brain and the spinal cord. What's new on this slide is that we need to know the four main parts of the brain that we're going to go over in this PowerPoint. The cerebrum, which is most of what you see, the diencephalon, which you can't see because it's deep in the brain. On this picture you can't see it. The brain stem, which is made up of three parts: midbrain, pons, and medulla. And then the cerebellum is the fourth part. So just for now, if you're asked for the four main parts of the brain, there they are, 1, 2, 3, 4, and we're going to go into them individually and know their subparts. Right, we're going to start with the cerebrum, and the cerebrum is what you see, the majority of the brain, the main part of the brain from the surface here. The cerebrum, if you look at it, is made up of elevated portions and creases or depressed areas. So those have names. A gyrus is an elevated portion, like what my pointer's on now. A sulcus is a groove, right? So plural for that would be gyri and sulci, or singular a gyrus and a sulcus. Now there's some deep grooves, actually one main deep groove. A deep groove is not a sulcus, it would be a fissure. So we can see right here we have a long fissure dividing the left hemisphere of the brain from the right hemisphere in the brain, and that's called the longitudinal fissure. So if we were to go all the way into this fissure, we'll eventually hit something, which you see in red here, and that's the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is the part of the brain that joins the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere, but you have to go deep into the groove in order to get there. Now the cerebrum, which is one of the four main parts of the brain, which you see here colored, has 5 lobes associated with it, and you should recognize 4 of these 5 lobes because they're named according to the cranial bones that are superficial to it. So here's your frontal lobe in red. You have a parietal lobe in, well, this color blue, an occipital lobe in the lighter blue, and then in the darkest blue here you'll see the temporal lobe. So those are the 4 lobes that should be relatively easy for you because of their names. And then there's actually a 5th lobe called the insula, and the insula is not visible from the surface. You can see there's some forceps here opening up, dividing the temporal lobe from the frontal lobe, and looking deep into the cerebrum, we see another lobe in here. It's called the insula. Insula because it's insulated, it's hidden. So those are your 5 lobes of the cerebrum, and they will exist on both sides, left hemisphere and right hemisphere. All right, we have some more anatomy to go through here on the cerebrum, or you can say in the cerebral hemispheres, left and right. There's a central sulcus. Remember, a sulcus is a groove. The central sulcus that you see pictured right here is the groove that divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. And on either side of the central sulcus we have a gyrus. The one on the frontal lobe side, anterior, is called the precentral gyrus, because pre means in front of, precentral, in front of the central sulcus. So this is your precentral gyrus. It is on the frontal lobe. And then on the other side of the central sulcus you have a postcentral gyrus. That's on the parietal lobe, and they're going to have functions which we're going to see in a little while. Right, then we see a parieto-occipital sulcus. That's a sulcus, not as well defined, but there's a sulcus that divides the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. And then we have a lateral sulcus right here. The lateral sulcus outlines the temporal lobe, so it divides the temporal lobe from the frontal lobe and also from the parietal lobe. So there's your lateral sulcus. So you should be aware of these sulci here and which lobes they separate. Now, an important part of the cerebrum is the cerebral cortex. Cortex means outer shell, so if we kind of look at this cross-section here, we can see the outer shell is darker than the inner cerebrum. So your cerebral cortex is this outer layer, which is most of your brain's mass. That's your gray matter. Gray matter, remember, is unmyelinated neurons, where if we go deeper, we go into white matter, which are myelinated. nervous tissue. But the cerebral cortex, yeah, that's your gray matter. So it's this entire surface, all these gyri and sulci and all of your lobes. That's your cerebral cortex, and that's the site of your conscious mind, which you can read here. Now we're going to look at all these different parts of each lobe, and we can see these different colored areas. We don't need to get into these specifically here on this slide, but just in general, these little areas are called Brodmann's areas, meaning this area right here has a responsibility, this area right here has a responsibility. So in general, they're just called Brodmann's areas. You don't really need to know that term, but we're going to look at each area and specifically the name of each specific region and what their function is in the upcoming slides. Right, so what you're going to want to do for these next quite a few slides here is be able to match a part of the brain with a function. So for example, the occipital lobe, which we see right over here, is for visual perception. So the information comes from your eyes, which is not visible here, but information will travel to the occipital lobe for processing. So that's your visual center. So you want to match your occipital lobe with visual perception, or your visual cortex. The temporal lobe, which we see over here, has a couple responsibilities. One is auditory, and the other is olfactory perception. So auditory has to do with hearing. Olfactory is your sense of smell. So auditory and olfactory, hearing and smell, that's processed in your temporal lobe. So your temporal lobe, match it with those two senses, hearing and smell, or better said, auditory and olfactory cortex or perception.